In our study of principle number 13 of Maimonides, of Rambam's 13 Principles of Faith, we have covered a lot of ground, but there is still more to cover. We are studying the concept of resurrection, the concept that the dead will come back alive, and we have discovered, and we will discover even more strongly, that there's a lot of uncertainty in this principle and this idea. There's a lot of opacity. It's not as easy to lay it out and to understand it in a clear fashion because this subject is deliberately concealed. It's deliberately masked by the sources. And the Talmud tells us that the reason for this is because even the prophets who could see the future, who could see the past, who could see different realms and dimensions, there are things that are beyond their purview as well. The Talmud tells us that the prophets, they prophesied about the times of Messiah. All the prophets talked about Messiah. But Olam Haba, which is the next world, the upcoming world, the prophets were not able to see it. Ayin lo rasa, an eye cannot absorb it. The physical eyes of the prophets cannot absorb the tremendous light of Olam Haba. Now, when we talk about resurrection, it's kind of between these two worlds. And we've seen this already in the past, that the world of Messiah, well, that's a change, an elevation, a transformation of our world, but it's still in our world. The rules of physics still apply. Bodies still exist. The understanding of how the world operates as we have it still endures. All of us a completely different world. And resurrection is almost like the bridge connecting the two. So we'll understand a little bit of it, and the prophecies do talk about it, but it's still murky because it is between Olam Haba and Messiah. Messiah we know a lot about. Olam Haba we know almost nothing about. We should just define it basically. And resurrection we know a little bit, but there's a lot of debate and discussion and deliberation and not a lot of consensus in all the details of resurrection. And of course, that's why we find a lot of disagreements in our studies. Today, what I wanted to do, I think it's appropriate to do, is to try to construct some timeline of the various different events that are milestones in the era of resurrection. I want to try to cover as best as we can the progression of the various different elements that are featured in the world of resurrection. And I want to begin with a citation from the Leshem. Leshem was one of the great Kabbalists, and he puts a lot of different ideas together in a coherent fashion, and he gives us a deeper insight into what happens and also why exactly resurrection, like what it does, how it transforms the world, and how it plays a part in a bigger picture. And of course, we'll also learn some new concepts along the way that we have hitherto not discussed. So let's begin. Messiah, we've spoken about that at great length. He tells us that will be a blend of miracles and nature. We have a world, and there's a world and all the rules of the world, and we understand the world as best as we can, but we have an understanding of this world. And Messiah is going to be a world very similar to ours. There's going to be just the natural phenomena of the world that will be in place. And this era of Messiah will precede resurrection, all types of resurrection. And there's going to be a gradual and incremental shift that's going to happen in the times of Messiah. This is what he tells us. All the transformations, all the changes that will be in the times of Messiah, it will start off in a way that blends, that mixes the teva, the nature, and the nes and the miracle, in a way similar to the Exodus. And this is a concept that we saw at great length in our studies of Messiah, that the Exodus from Egypt is the blueprint that all redemptions follow, And thus, to understand Messiah, we have to really understand the Exodus from Egypt. So he tells us that just as was true with the Exodus from Egypt, that there was, at the beginning, there was a blend of miracles and nature, so too in the times of Messiah, there will be a blend, at least initially, of miracles and nature. Now, he gives us a deeper insight as to what exactly he means. What do we mean by miracles and nature? The Exodus began with miracles. The plagues are all miraculous. So what does he mean by saying that the Exodus, and thus the Messiah as well, which is modeled after the Exodus, will be a blend of miracles and nature? So even though, he tells us, the very beginning of the Exodus from Egypt began right away with miracles, that's true. But the state of the nation in Egypt, they were physical. They were humans like they were previously. You take a human, an Israelite in Egypt, 5 years before the Exodus, and during the Exodus, during the miracles, they're the same being. So they're a natural, physical, material person like they were previously. It's just that there are miracles as well in the world around them. And then he adds an important point. The human, the way it started off, humanity, it started off in a very different fashion, with a very different set of rules than what ensued. Adam and Eve, before their sin, they were a different human. We will call that a miraculous human. They were loftier than the angels. The angels sought to worship them. The sources describe Adam and Eve before their sin in completely superlative terms. They're a human, we're humans, but they're different. The Jewish people, during the Exodus, the Israelites, they were humans the way we think of humans, post-sin humans. They weren't like Adam and Eve before their sin. So yeah, there were miracles, but there was still nature. At Sinai, at the revelation at Sinai, the Israelites completed this transformation from natural to supernatural, from Adam post-sin to be restored to the pristine purity of Adam pre-sin. That's the process of going from a mixture of natural and miraculous to just miraculous. That's what happened at the Exodus, and that is what will happen in the times of Messiah. Messiah will begin, the Leshem tells us, and there will be miracles right away. But the miracles will be not completely dominant, the dominant feature of existence. There will also be the baseline humanity. We will not be like Adam and Eve before their sin. We'll be humans the way we always were. But there will be miracles around us. So you can have a mixture of what he calls nature and miracles. And again, the definition of that is because the chomrios, the gashmios, which are Hebrew terms, the physicality and materialism of the world, which is the world as we know it today, that will still reign at the beginning of the Messianic era. And slowly and gradually, the miracles, the supernatural existence will overtake the natural, the default existence that we know of today. It will slowly overtake it gradually and in an incremental process. And there will still be what we call nature, physicality, coarseness, callousness, a dominant feature of physicality. The animal, so to speak, in the animal and angel hybrid, that will still be a feature of the world in the times of Messiah until the times of the resurrection. Until the times of resurrection, there's still going to be an element of what he calls physicality, what he calls nature, Adam post his sin. In the times of Messiah, there will be the resurrection. The resurrection will happen at a minimum of 40 years after the element of Messiah called the ingathering of exiles. As we have seen, Messiah means a lot of different things. There's the individual Messiah, there's the Messianic era. Part of the Messianic era is what's known as the ingathering of the exiles. At a minimum of 40 years post the ingathering of the exiles, that's when the resurrection begins. So we have a time of Messiah, and we have in the Messianic era, we have at a minimum of 40 years post the ingathering of the exiles, we have the resurrection. And in that time, it's the times of Messiah, and there are some miracles, but the world effectively is very similar to the world that we know of as today. And it's going to change. And it's going to begin this process of expunging the effects of the sin of Adam over the course of these 40 years until it reaches the point known as resurrection. And even then, it's a process. It's not resurrection all at once. There's a process, slow and incremental and gradual change, bit by bit, to the next level of cleansing and uplifting and upgrading the world and humanity. This is how he begins his piece. He's describing a process of change from natural to supernatural, from coarseness, from physicality to a more ethereal, more spiritual existence. And one of the words that he uses, and it's always helpful to see this in the original Hebrew, a term that he highlights a few times in this piece, is zuhama. I don't know how to translate it, but it's some sort of spiritual contamination. The Talmud tells us that when Adam and Eve sinned, they got zuhama, some sort of venom of the serpent that was infused and that was injected into them. The influence of the sin of Adam and Eve, and the influence of the serpent, it now operates within mankind, within humanity. And the process of Messiah and resurrection is a whole process trying to undo that, to fix that, to restore the pristine level of humanity. Now, this already happened once, he tells us. We already had a moment in time, a moment in history, where the zuhama, where the effects of the sin of Adam and Eve were removed. That happened at the Sinai revelation, 50 days after the Exodus. And again, there was a gradual messianic, if you will, process from when the plagues began until Sinai, and that was a mixture where some of the zuhama was still present, but there were miracles already. But it wasn't done until Sinai. And thus, the resurrection mirrors the Sinai revelation. That's what the Leshem is telling us. Prior to Sinai, there were miracles, sure, but humanity was still in the model, in the paradigm of Adam post-sin. At Sinai, the nation, or at least parts of the nation, were in some way akin to humanity prior to the sin. So we have, again, a process. In Egypt, there's a whole year of plagues, miraculous plagues, of course, but fundamentally, humanity is the same as it was prior. There's the admixture of natural, of what we call natural, and supernatural. And there are the miracles, and the Exodus, and post the Exodus, splitting of the sea, and they're eating manna, and they're waging this miraculous war against Amalek. But they still have not completely altered their physiology. And with this gradual and incremental process, they arrive at Sinai, and they prepare for Sinai, and they experience what no other people have ever experienced. And that experience of the Almighty tearing open the heavens and creating this touch point with humanity, at that moment, the zuhama, that venomous influence of the serpent, was finally expunged. And this is the same process that Leshem tells us, a Messiah in gathering of the exiles, and then a minimum of 40 years later, and then there's the resurrection. At the point of resurrection, that's when the world begins to change over. That's this process of the cleansing, of the expunging of the zuhama to restore the world to its primordial ideal, to the way it was prior to the sin of Adam and Eve. And again, he tells us, resurrection is also not a one-time switch. It's a slow and gradual and incremental process. So if we had in times of Messiah a mixture of natural and supernatural, in the times of resurrection, we're going to have that same thing, a mix of natural and supernatural, of the next level of natural and supernatural, a mix of humans who were resurrected and humans who were not resurrected. And they're going to look very differently. The process of cleansing the world is very much accelerated by resurrection. You think about it, Abraham comes back to the world. Moshe comes back to the world. These people emerge and they're here. And what do they look like? Like Adam before his sin or Adam after his sin? These were elevated people. These are righteous people to begin with. And they experienced the cleansing process of death. And when they emerge, they are like veritable angels. And we're going to have this strange coexistence of resurrected angels and non-resurrected non-angels. So these veritable angels that are resurrected are going to be around in the same universe as regular, ordinary people who are still alive. This is what he means when he says resurrection is not all at once. And he quotes some citations in the Talmud that tell us, one from the book of Psachim, page 68a, one from Bava Basra, page 75b, that point to the fact that even after all the righteous were resurrected, and they emerge, in his words, they are like the zenith of the heavens, which is, again, very fancy terms for being just completely different humans than the ones we're familiar with. There will still be in that generation, there will still be people that have not yet died. So you have people that, everyone's working on a different timeline here. Those that are ready to be resurrected will be resurrected. Those have not yet died, well, they've not yet died, and they've not yet, certainly not yet resurrected. So they still need to die and to be resurrected. And he cites from the Talmud, a strange sounding Talmud, that the righteous people will announce kadosh, holy, upon them. What does that mean? What it means is that all the people that are alive today in our world, they have not yet died, have not yet been purified, have not yet been cleansed. They will be in the same universe as those who already have been resurrected. And the only word that you could say to describe those people is kadosh, holy. Because they were already in this process of resurrection, and they're like Adam before their sin, and they're walking around with us, if we're meritorious. And then he brings another very, very interesting point. In the times of resurrection, which again is a long process, he tells us that it's going to be hundreds of years. We have humanity turning over. And we have the bodies decomposing in the ground and coming back alive in a very different fashion. And they'll be holy, and they'll be cleansed, and they'll be pure, and they'll be polished like the zenith of the heavens. And these are people who died in the past. And he points us in a very interesting direction here. He says, wait a minute. One of the hallmarks of the times of Messiah is the elimination of the Yetzer Hara. We spoke about this at great length when we talked about Messiah. Well, Yetzer Hara has another name, another role really. The Talmud tells us, quite memorably, Hu Yetzer Hara, Hu Satan, Hu Malach HaMavis. There's a three-headed monster called Yetzer Hara, Satan, Malach HaMavis. The Yetzer Hara, the Satan, and the angel of death. If one of the features of the Messianic era is the elimination of the Yetzer Hara, by definition, it's also the elimination of the angel of death. It's just a different name for the same thing. So if we are in a Messianic world, and there's no Yetzer Hara, then there's no angel of death, but there are still people who have not yet died. Well, how do those people who have not yet died, how do they die if there's no angel of death? Again, these are very advanced levels of study. This is, it's maybe Torah 101, but this is a deep question. If people are alive in times of Messiah, and they have to die, and they have to be resurrected, but there ain't no angel of death. So what's going to happen to those people? And what's their process? And how is it different? Their death, and maybe their subsequent resurrection, how is that different than those who died at the hands, so to speak, of the angel of death? So he tells us that there's a different process. In the times of Messiah, one of the features is the elimination of the Yetzer Hara, and thus the elimination of the angel of death. And therefore, we have to investigate the people who are alive at that time, who are coexisting with those angels. They've yet to die. Have yet to be resurrected, of course. How will they die? So he tells us, again, and this is an idea that we've touched upon, death is necessary. Because if there's going to be this turnover, if there's going to be this elimination of the physicality of the body to be able to recreate it in a different dimension and paradigm, there has to be some sort of process of death that's beneficial. And he uses some very interesting Kabbalistic code words. There's the transformation of kosnos or to kosnos or, which sounds the same. But the word or, if it's spelled with an ayin, it means flesh or skin. If it's spelled with an aleph, it means light or light. Adam and Eve, they had kosnos or garments of or. But initially that was or with an aleph, the garments of light, which means that their body almost did not inhibit the brilliant light of their soul. It was simply a vessel. But the light of the soul shone forth unimpeded. That's what their body was previously. After they sinned, God made them leather garments. That's how you would read it in scripture. But he made them physical garments that blocked the brilliant light of their soul from permeating forth. If we saw Adam and Eve, just you and I, if we witnessed Adam and Eve before their sin, we would die. We couldn't look at him. Because again, the angels, if we would see an angel, we would die, right? We wouldn't be able to handle that. But the angels themselves couldn't handle witnessing Adam and Eve before their sin. Because their body was just a garment of light. And yes, kosnos or remained kosnos or, but now the aleph was switched to an ayin. It's just a leather garment that is not completely, but mostly guarding and suppressing the light of the soul. Well, that has to be undone. The body has to be transformed from a kosnos or with an ayin, a leather garment, a skin garment, a fleshy garment, to a garment of light. That has to be done. There has to be death. But there ain't no angel of death. So these people will die, not at the hands of the angel of death, which of course is not an independent entity. There is no independent entity, it's just God. But this tool, this implement of God is no longer, God himself will serve as the angel of death, so to speak, will cause the death and the resurrection as well. And regarding this, the verse says, Ani amis ve'achayeh, I will cause death and I will bring back to life. So we have a very different type of death. A death not done via the angel of death, rather by God himself. And then this process of death and the cleansing of it, it's also going to be different than the typical process of death and the cleansing that happens to those righteous who have passed away in the past, unlike the righteous people who died 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago and so on, they've had a few thousand years of elevation and rectification in their death and they're ready to go now. But they took a couple of thousand years to be rectified. Those who are alive in the times of the resurrection, in their lifetime, when they're still alive, they're going to be undergoing the same cleansing process that those who passed away in the past at the hands of the angel of death went through in their death. In their lifetime, they're going to be cleansed. And therefore, when they die, they can be immediately be resurrected. Because when will they die? The righteous, in the times of the resurrection, when will they die? They will only die once they're ready to be resurrected right away. So there's just a turn off switch and a turn right back on switch. They die at hands of God, and right away they're resurrected because they only die once they are ready to be resurrected, immediately post their instantaneous demise and rebirth. So what he's telling us, there's a lot of different moving parts here, of course. What he's telling us is that the righteous in the times, who have yet to die, in the times of resurrection, in their lifetime, because there is no Yetzer Hara, there is no Satan, there is no angel of death, that world, that universe, will be one where their soul is very dominant. And their soul is going to undergo this, or is going to spearhead this process of cleansing themselves that typically, ever since the sin of Adam, can only happen in death. It will happen in life, and therefore, once they're finished and they're ready to be resurrected, they'll die, turn it off, turn it back on, and be reborn with the Kosnos R, with the garments of light. And again, he tells us, this is not all at once, and it's not a uniform death and revival. And I will note, by the way, he uses terms of speculation. He says, nearer, it seems. This is not definitive because then there are no definitive, or at least there don't seem to be clear and definitive sources that are unambiguous. Nearer, it seems that those who are alive in times of resurrection, who have yet to die, have yet to be resurrected, they will be different from each other in the times of their death and the times of their resurrection. Meaning that they will not all die at once. They'll all die when they're ready to die. And thus they will all be reborn immediately after their death, and it won't be uniform across the board. And then this is where he tells us that it's going to be for a very long time, 210 years perhaps, or maybe even more, 214 years, or maybe there is no definitive time. It will start, the times of the resurrection will start 40 years after the ingathering of the exiles, and then it will take some amount of time, either 210 years, 214 years, or an undefined time. Everyone will be resurrected, and thus the time of resurrection will be concluded. Now, we're still trying to piece together here this full timeline of resurrection, and it's a bit easier said than done, because if we want to piece together the times of resurrection, well, what happens next? If everyone's alive, everyone's resurrected, we know that that's not the end point. The end point is Olam Haba, the world to come. There are some intervening events and timelines that happen in between the resurrection and Olam Haba. And one of the things that has to happen is what's known as the 7th millennium. We'll talk more about that in a bit. But before that, there's what's known as the Yom Hadin Hagadol V'Hanora, the great and awesome day of judgment. Now, what does this mean? Before we can have the 7th millennium, when the world is going to be very much in a state of limbo, as we shall see, the world, as we know it, will be destroyed. but it will yet to have been reborn. That's going to happen in the 8th millennium, the 9th millennium, the 10th millennium, as we shall see. Before all of that, there has to be a great and awesome day of judgment. And that's when everyone who has been alive at any point in the world, there will have to be a great and awesome day of judgment to determine their final state in Olam Haba. And the commentaries tell us that even though when someone dies, we know this, the Talmud tells us, we've spoken about this at length, someone dies, they have a heart attack, God forbid, they are in an accident, whatever, they got cancer, they die at a very old age, let's say. There is judgment, and maybe even a few concentric layers of judgment that happen right after they die. In their state of death, when they're not in this world. They're in the world of the souls, as it is called. There is judgment. Are they worthy of all the various different places that people could go after they die? We talked about the various different judgments. We talked about the lower paradise and the upper paradise and the manifold different levels of paradise. Well, how is that determined? Will someone be reincarnated? Will someone end up in Gehenom? There's lots and lots of different verdicts that can fall upon a person after they die. And all that is determined by a judgment. So everyone, once they're dead, they've been judged already. So this idea of this great and awesome day of judgment, it needs to be understood. Why is there a need for a great and awesome judgment? And the sources tell us that this judgment is the final tally, the final tallies. If a person dies, or when a person dies, they're judged for all their behavior. Every single deed, the positive and the negative, every single speech, every single thought, everything that they did and that they caused to be done will all be judged by the heavenly tribunals. Nothing will be missed out. Absolutely nothing. But 100 years after someone dies, their coffers are still being evaluated. Because if someone has a child, and the child does a mitzvah, part of that gets attributed to the parent. If someone inspires someone, if someone invests in someone, the merits that are spawned by a person's behavior, they get attributed back to the person's original behavior. So when we study the works of Rashi today, he gets reward for it. Not to the exclusion of our reward, of course. But Rashi lived 1,000 years ago almost. And he's still making bank every single day, every single moment when people study the works of Rashi. So Rashi passed, he was judged in the heavenly courts, of course. But we cannot have the final tallies until the entirety of this world is done. So the great and awesome day of judgment covers absolutely everything and all the consequences of a person's behavior and all the after effects of a person's behavior and all the reverberations of a person's behavior. Every single element of that is taken into account to determine a person's ultimate state. Now, the Ramban, in a few different places, he talks about this, and he gives us a nice way to think about it, of this great and awesome day of judgment. He tells us, and again I will note, in the Shar HaGmul, which is a section of his book it's often printed as its own book. It's called The Gates of Reward. That's his magisterial work on reward and punishment and eschatology. He says, Yesh ladas Rabbeinu. Says there is an opinion amongst our sages, even though it's actually featured in the literature, in the scripture, in the end of Malachi, which is the very end of the Tanakh, he doesn't introduce it with definitiveness. And he tells us that there are 3 judgments. Every year, of course, we know, on Rosh Hashanah, the whole world is judged. That's one judgment. The annual Rosh Hashanah judgment. A second level of judgment is on the day of a person's death. What's going to be their status in the world of souls? Will they merit to end up in a good place, or will they suffer in Gehenna? That's determined based upon a person's behavior and actions and choices. And on this great and awesome day of judgment, which will happen towards the beginning, he tells us, which I'm not sure if this is universally agreed upon. Is it towards the beginning or towards the end? But he says towards the beginning of the times of resurrection, that will be determining the ultimate state of reward and or punishment of someone in Olam Haba, in the eternal world. Will they merit the resurrection? Will they merit this bliss and this completely superlative pleasure of Olam Haba? Or will they, God forbid, be condemned to eternal ignominy, as is also the option, is also potentially feasible for the wicked? All that is determined in the great and awesome judgment. And he repeats this theme in other works, that there is a day of judgment, an awesome and great day of judgment, which he stresses. It's a day of judgment for both the body and the soul. Because again, this is once the body and soul are reunited. Again, the body looks absolutely nothing like it looks in our understanding of the body. But the body and soul have been reunited, and everything's been tallied up. Now it's time for this judgment. And it is noteworthy, the commentaries tell us. Even the most righteous of the righteous were terrified about this day. The Midrash tells us that Samuel is one of the greatest people of all time. According to our sages, on some level, in some dimension, Samuel was equal to Moshe and Aaron put together. But even Samuel, he had a dread for this great and awesome day. Because again, anything that you do that could potentially lead towards something negative, that gets added, that accrues, so to speak, to your tally. And that is quite dreadful. So again, with the timeline, it's not exactly clear at what point in the era of resurrection this great and awesome day of judgment happens, but it is a feature that is part of it, and that's going to be preparing or determining what a person's final state is going to be in Olam Haba. And all this has to happen before the year 6000, before the 7th millennium commences. Now, what is this 7th millennium that we have mentioned? So the Talmud tells us that this world as we know it, it's a 6,000-year enterprise. And what about afterwards? Just as there's 6 days of creation and there's 1 day of cessation of creation, so too there are 6 days, 6 divine days. A day of God, so to speak, we're told, is 1,000 years. There are 6,000 years of this world, and then 1,000 years of Shabbos, of cessation of this world. The Talmud tells us, the book of Sanhedrin, page 92b, this world is a 6,000-year world. V'chad charov. And 1 millennium, it will be destroyed. At that time, God will be alone. this world, this creation of God, this creation of an existence outside of God, that, or at least as we know it, ceases. Now, the righteous, they're not destroyed. It was determined in the great and awesome day of judgment that they will endure forever. Now, what does that mean? Again, the Talmud uses coded language, and it deliberately conceals what its true intentions are. In the words of the Talmud, the righteous in the 7th millennium, God gives them wings, and they fly over the destroyed world. Yeah, they don't get tired. Unlike, if you imagine, flapping your wings, you do it it's like treading water. You do it for, a minute or two and you're very tired. No. The righteous in the 7th millennium, they will have wings and they will fly over the destroyed world and they won't get tired. Now what that means, I don't know. But conceptually, what we're told is like this. There is a 6,000 year period of this world. And at the end of this world, of the Messianic era and the resurrection era. And before this world can turn over, can be reborn, can be transformed into the world to come, which again is completely beyond our understanding. Even the greatest of prophets could not foresee that. Yes, maybe they could foresee a little bit about Messiah, certainly, about the resurrection, about the great and awesome day of judgment, maybe even about the 7th millennium. But the 8th millennium, or the 9th, or the 10th, that is beyond the greatest of prophets. They cannot have a clear image of what that was. Nevertheless, we are given some basic frameworks. So 6,000 years, and then the 7th millennium. And then we have the 8th millennium. In the 7th millennium, the world, we said, it's in limbo. The world has not yet been renewed. The world, as we know it, has been destroyed. It has not yet been renewed, so it's in between. The righteous are still alive. They were resurrected. They're resurrected now. They're not going to die. But God will make them wings, whatever that means. He tells us that they're going to ascend above the land. And they will be, says Ramchal, they will be in a similar state to the way Moshe was when he ascended the mountain. So again, he's giving us a picture of what it means the righteous in the 7th millennium. They'll be in a way similar to Moshe when he went up the mountain and he's in heaven and he's negotiating with the angels and he's getting the Torah. So he's very different than a human as we know of him, of a human. That we wouldn't describe a human as one who's able to go up to heaven and argue with angels and be in the presence of God. He has transcended the state of an ordinary human. That is when the Talmud tells us that the tzaddikim, the righteous in the 7th millennium, they will grow wings and they'll fly above the world. That's what it means. They'll be like Moshe at Sinai. They have departed, so to speak, from the state of ordinary humanity the way we know it. In this 7th millennium, it's like Shabbos. There is rest. There is menucha. It's a time of cessation of the world as we know it. Olam Haba has not yet begun. The 8th millennium, that's the rebirth of the world. And that's when the world begins to transition into its ultimate and permanent state, the state for which God created the world, created existence. God created existence, we're told, for the purposes of benefiting humanity, of showering humanity, of endowing humanity with the greatest experience possible. That is the domain of the world to come, and that begins in the 8th millennium, so year 7,000. Regarding that time, In the words of Ramchal, "I efshar lahasidam," we cannot fathom them. We cannot know them. What do we know? We do know is that the physicality melts away, or at least it effectively melts away because it no longer has a dominant say. And the soul is restored to the way it was initially, and the world exists in the intended state, the way it was supposed to be had Adam not sinned. There's going to be this transformation of the world and of the body, and there's going to be this elevation and cleansing to prepare the world for its ultimate state, which it's not clear exactly when and how that is. Is it in the 8th millennium? Or is it the beginning of the Olam Haba? Is it in the 9th millennium? Or perhaps it will be in the 10th millennium. Of course, these are subjects that are so completely beyond our understanding. And we know, the Talmud tells us very clearly, even the greatest prophets could not foresee that future universe, that world to come, that is completely different than our world. There are still lots of subjects that we need to investigate more. And again, it's very hard to piece this together in a seamless way because not everything is universally agreed upon. But I think we did make some progress in our objective of trying to understand the 13 principles of faith as best as we can. We have this idea of resurrection, which is getting much closer to the furthest extent of what we can't even fathom. And we've seen a lot of very mind-blowing things. This is one of those ideas that you really have to study and restudy and listen and re-listen to hear this again and again to really understand all the various moving parts. And again, I want to give that disclaimer again. These are very weighty subjects and very lofty subjects. And we don't know enough to say anything with absolute definitiveness, which is why, of course, we rely on our great predecessors, on the people that knew way more than we'll ever know, and how they organized it and how they presented it, and we can just read it and share it as best as we can. I found this to be very helpful, beneficial. It's very illuminating. I think it does help give us more of a sense of the timeline and the various different events and the objective of each one of these states and moments and milestones of transformation. And hopefully this will give us more of an insight as we try to understand more maybe of what we know, and of course more about what we don't know. Even if we know what we don't know, that is progress. That's a level of understanding. If we go as far as we can and we reach a point where we have to kind of humbly accept our ignorance, that's okay. At least we did our best faith effort. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And of course, my email address is rabbiwolbe@gmail.com. I'm looking forward, please God, to continuing our study of the 13 principles of faith. There are certainly some more subjects that we need to ponder and probe, but we're nearing the end. We've done almost 80 episodes on the 13 principles of faith. I hope that we did an adequate job in trying to understand them as best as we can. Again, there are some more subjects we need to cover, but not many more. So we're nearing the end, and I enjoyed this. I think this was a wonderful study and an opportunity to really delve into these subjects that most people just say, I don't know, most people just ballpark it. We decided not to do that, and we followed the sources as best as we can, and I hope we gained some insight. And again, I'd love to hear your comments and your feedback and your questions. And my email address is rabbiwolbe@gmail.com.